the laws of war in themselves are so incredibly indeterminate that they're not really fit for purpose to the kind of conflicts that we're seeing, especially when you can bomb a Jabalia refugee camp and 200 can die, and you can be like, oh no, but the Hamas commanders there were incredibly important.
But I think the first real misconception that a lot of people have is that international law is a legal system. Right. We really don't have any equivalence at the international level of these things. This is, at best, I would say, a form of alternative dispute resolution, really, right, where you have really a mechanism that has been devised to mediate between national interests of various different states, which can obviously collide at times, and try to reduce the friction that is caused in these elements and try to bring some civility. And I think it's a mistake to really interpret it or even look at international law as giving us something along those lines.
So international law is not failing. International law, the growth of international law in space has probably reduced, but it's also because of the saturation point, because there are so many laws already for so many things. But every single day, there is some sort of norm making, there's some sort of implementation, and even the countries like were major violators of international law, like Israel, or so for example, they are violating IHL, they are violating ICJ's judgment, they are violating UN Charter, but so many other things they are doing. For example, international aviation law, space law, they follow those regulations every single day.
Powered by International Committee of the Red Cross.
Hello and welcome to Legally Speaking with DawnNews English. This is your host, Ayesha Malik. Over the last few years, given the flagrant violations we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine war, the conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and the Sudanese civil war, skepticism towards international law and the laws of war in particular has grown immensely. These flagrant violations of international law include aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and also arguably genocide. Modern international law arose out of the horrors of World War II to prevent them from occurring again, with the preamble to the UN Charter stating that the objectives of the UN boldly were that we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. So has international law failed in its promise then? To discuss this, we'll be talking to Sadia Abbasi, an international expert, and to Ovais, Anwer, director at the Research Society of International Law, who will help us understand whether we should maintain our hope in international law or acknowledge that it has failed and look for that hope elsewhere. So Ovais, I wanted to start off by asking you, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions people have about international law among the people who don't really know that much about it?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. But I think the first real misconception that a lot of people have is that international law is a legal system, right? We're going to have problems interpreting or understanding international law if we compare it to, say, domestic legal systems, say the Pakistani legal system, where you have a court mechanism and you have the executive and the police to enforce laws. You have the legislature, parliament to make laws, and then the judiciary to interpret and apply those laws. We really don't have any equivalence at the international level of these things. This is, at best, I would say, a form of alternative dispute resolution, really, right, where you have really a mechanism that has been devised to mediate between national interests of various different states, which can obviously collide at times, and try to reduce the friction that is caused in these elements and try to bring some civility to those. But if we're talking about a domestic system where laws can be enforced, we don't really have that at the international level. And I think it's a mistake to really interpret it or even look at international law as giving us something along those lines. What I keep on saying is that if people in suits, if men and women in suits aren't able to resolve an issue, then it's men and women in uniform who tend to resolve the issue. So that's why it's you had your laws of the jungle or might is right principles applying. And then you had international law, which tried to bring or find mechanisms to resolve these disputes without having to resort to military force. And where that breaks down is then you shift back to the default mechanism, which is warfare, unfortunately. And so I think that's one way of really looking at it. The other issue that I think big misconception is that international law can enforce a lot of the the decisions that are made, or even enforce its own basic tenets. And that really isn't the case. International law is, at least theoretically, it's a creature, a fiction that has been created by equals, right? And it is something that in a domestic system, you have a top-down approach, really, right? You have the government which can enforce the laws on the people, right? Whereas in international law, it's entities themselves or states themselves which are enforcing these things amongst themselves, and that is really where that principle, which is hard to get away from, of might is right, comes in.
See, when we have crimes, when we have constitutional crisis in any country, we don't say the constitutional law is failing or criminal law is failing. We say that we need to better implementation. We need better laws. So when it comes to international law, we essentially have to reframe or restructure or realign our expectation from international law. So we cannot expect international law to deliver things that we have not that international law has not promised, or the states have not empowered international institutions to do. So if UN Charter was there to protect the rights of people and to ensure peace, was the structure to implement those principles forcefully were implemented? Was that power given to UN? No. We haven't given that power to United Nations or to, for that matter, any other international law body. So when we expect international law to deliver, we should also know what kind of power states have given. Essentially, it's a state-led system. The unfortunate part is that we consider international law from the perspective of a domestic law, where there is a sovereign body, sovereign lawgiver, somebody is there to implement, somebody is there to police. Unfortunately, that's not what international law is, and that's where the problem starts. That people have expectation of a domestic law, how they expect international law to perform, and that's not possible until unless the states restructure, reframe, and realign their laws and empower international bodies like UN to deliver on the promises that they have made in the UN Charter. Also, whatever is happening in Palestine, Ukraine. You have mentioned Sudan. In fact, what happened recently in our own region, all these things are horrendous, and I don't want to be like sound callous, but UN Charter, international law has delivered more often than not. Whether it's about peace, whether it's about other things, essentially when because you have framed your question from the UN Charter, but international law is much bigger body than UN Charter. Its job is not just to protect, but to regulate, for example, aviation, to regulate global commons. So UN international law delivered every day. States do submit to it, follow it, align their policies, internal policies with it. So I think UN Charter definitely needs, international law needs a we have to restructure it and realign it, but it's not an absolute abject failure, in my opinion.
I happen to agree with you. I think that looking to international as this kind of superhero which is going to come in and save the day it's never been for that. The institutions, as you rightly pointed out, they've just never been empowered to do that, to have that enforcement capability. And I think what you're saying kind of goes back to that Louis Henkin quote, which is almost all of international law is almost always applied by almost all states almost all of the time.
So you gave 5 distinguished powers of the world, a role in the UN Security Council. You allowed space for entities like NATO to be able to have space and be able to conduct their affairs through military means throughout history, especially the post-World War history that we've seen. And that really becomes the issue there, that you don't have a means of enforcing it. The UN Security Council can't really enforce it. I mean, the UN Security Council is a body, but if you get consensus there, then it becomes somewhat enforceable, and that is exceedingly rare. And we've seen this in the past decades. So I think those are some of the biggest misconceptions with regards to international law.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you have a system based on this notion of juridical equality, that the value of statehood, the sovereignty, and the prerogative that statehood gives you, including that right to self-defense. But the issue there is the fact that you have already got an in-baked power inequality in the form of the P5. And so what you need to, if you were to have a Security Council resolution passed, the mere fact of having consensus is so difficult to come by, and you would actually have to have absolutely no friends on the P5 to really have a resolution passed against you. And I think that the P5 to me is the core element which undermines now what the international community should have, which is the General Assembly being the one that can make decisions and that can enforce the will of that international community. Do you see that too, in the form of that is where we're lacking in enforcement, or do you think that it's much deeper than that?
Look, actually, you've known me for quite some time, and I've always had, an idealistic notion of international law. But I think over the last 2, 3 years, I've
Yeah, I
had
think we all have. Yeah.
crisis of faith, really, in international law. I don't think that we will ever get to a stage where you will see countries that can enforce their will through other means, and by that I mean, military force or sanctions or trade embargoes or whatever tools they have at their disposal, and sacrifice that at the altar of equality and justice and civility and whatnot. We will always see a level of inequality, and what we have right now may be the best of the many bad options, right? And so we have to go back to when the UN system was created. The post-World War II order was always underwritten by the US and Western Europe, right? This was a Western-centric order. And so when you design it and when you pay for it and when you keep it going and manage and maintain it, you are going to build in things that benefit you as a group. And so we've always seen that happen. It's only really, and throughout history, we've seen these same powers who underwrite it violate international law and come up with solutions and arguments. And that's really how international law has evolved over the past few decades. But it's really been the last 2 years, and with Israel's aggression, also with Russia and Ukraine, where we've seen such a blatant disregard that what international law had going for itself was this, this sanctity accorded to it, that, we will not violate certain principles, but such core principles have been violated of international law, whether it's non-interference, whether it's protecting the individual, whether it's the laws of war and, not committing genocide.
Yeah.
Exactly. Not committing genocide or war crimes, things like that. They have been violated and violated in such a blatant manner that there's really no coming back from that. And we even see from a lot of the Israeli arguments, they still deny genocide, but they have absolutely no problem doing what, say, 2 years ago, they were trying to justify with a lot of legalese and a lot of, legal acrobatics, if you will. They don't even try anymore because they're so comfortable and they're so set in their in the knowledge that nothing's going to happen to them. There are no repercussions to this. And that, I think, is really the biggest threat that we have to international law. And it is going to take decades, in my opinion, for this sanctity to be, if at all, if the sanctity comes back, because then what you have is a completely, hypocritical system where it applies for some and it doesn't apply for the others. So for the global North, international law will be a tool to keep people in check, and for the global South, it's going to be something. They're the ones who are going to be kept in check, right?
It should not be tilted towards one sort of type of people or sort of one continent that's or any sort of one sort of people. So we have to we have to democratize. We have to make sure that it has a more of an input from other countries. And norm making, we have to essentially change the way that we have the process of norm making, and then countries like our own country has to participate when actually the norm making process is going on. For example, right now that we are talking, we have a lot of things going on with regard to investment arbitration, climate change, cyber security, or AI, and essentially states from global South, including India and China, should participate in that global rule making and global norm making, so that they reflect the wishes and protect interests of wider sort of audience. So that's the third thing. And fourth is, I think the institutions like ICC, UN itself needs reforms. We have to see how we want to reform veto, for example. We have to see how we want to empower UNGA, how effectively we can use it, and even courts, international courts, including International Court of Justice, because its docket is busier than ever. But what about the implementation? I think the implementation or of its order or the compliance with its judgments is reducing, and it's not. And essentially, we love to create villains. We love to create heroes, but we also love to create villains. We think that it's a Trump phenomena, and Trump has changed it. But no, it was Brexit. It was when Central and South American states thought that exit was something which was enforced from outside. It was when states started thinking that bilateral investment treaties are something which is hindering their policy making, or the environmental law is some sort of evil that is stopping them from implementing their agendas. So there's a constant process of eroding the effectiveness and credibility of international law by different actors, mostly by the leaders who have sort of fascist tendencies, but essentially by anybody who thought that international law is creating some sort of hindrance to their implementation of their political agenda. So yeah, it's not a Trump phenomena alone. Many have contributed and are contributing. All those. We talk about double standard and hypocrisy in international law, but that essentially is, if you don't mind me, you and I both are hypocrites. We will love. We say that why international criminal law international criminal courts warrants are not being implemented for Netanyahu or Grant. But you know what? If Pakistan decides to join ICC today, we will write about it. Don't do it. It is essentially exposing the structure of international law, where states prioritize their national interests over common collective well-being. And in the hope that something bad will not happen to it. But because, for example, the first Trump administration, the focus was on China with regard to trade and tariffs. This time around, it's everybody. And nobody's immune. So I think essentially everybody has to understand that we have to find a common minimum agenda where we can come together and reform. And so for example, United Nations Security Council, do we need more countries with veto power? More of the same? Or we need essentially a more democratic Security Council. But then, we have to learn from the experience of League of Nations also, where if you will not protect the interests of the powerful countries, they will get out of the institution, and it will be a redundant institution, useless institution. So, we have to balance the political realities of the world with the changing realities also, and give voices to people, especially from Global South, which were underrepresented in international bodies. So essentially educate people, enforce better institutions and laws within international laws within the country. And third is have a better institutions, empower them. And fourth is be a little less hypocrite when it comes to international law, all of us.
So I am one of the people who think that Pakistan should definitely not be a part of the ICC, and I also think that Netanyahu and Putin and Omar al-Bashir have immunity and they should not be arrested. But when it comes to the Global South, I think in terms of the changing realities, one of those is the greater economic weight that Global South countries have. And how do you think that they should leverage their increasing power in the sense of norm making and rule making now in international? I think it was a really seminal moment for the Global South to see South Africa be the country taking Israel to the ICJ. Of course, they've been completely quiet after a few rounds of preliminary orders, and then we did not hear anything from the state, and it seems like the state has changed its policy. It does not really want to go against Israel, but that case is still there. They're still fighting that case for what it's worth. So how do you think that the Global South countries can have a greater role in that?
I think the first thing about South Africa, if I'm not wrong, and I'm totally forgetting, and just a couple of days back, a Hague group of countries, including South Africa, had this conference where they have this resolution also. Some of South Africa, Netherlands, these countries, Libya are part of it, and countries like Pakistan and many other were observers. They passed a resolution also with regard to Israel and how they want to economically and see different options, how to deal with Israel. So South Africa is doing something.
Right.
It's not quite. So economic power, I think that's the reality check. When we say the global South has some sort of economic cloud, China is emerging for sure and has the money. But when it comes to the rest of the global South, and whether China is part of the global South is or not is a debate in itself.
Yeah.
But the rest of the South is struggling economically. And when it comes to military might of West, especially of US, it's still more than combined military power of all other countries. So that sort of reality tilt, favored in the power in the favor of West. So I think. I think it's if we will look from the military and economic might point of view, I don't think so. We will find anything substantial or more powerful argument. I think the more powerful argument is if their states themselves follow international law and take initiatives. So even with South Africa, it has its own problems, including human rights problems, economic problems. But that doesn't mean that you can't speak for the countries. If you believe in something, you can't follow it up and take initiatives.
I wanted to follow up about that question of the rise of China and multipolarity, and we're seeing some sense that the Chinese are trying to make their own institutions. So even with their own form of, we've heard talk for a long time now about the BRICS Bank, which would rival the Bretton Woods institutions, including the World Bank, and now something which would rival the International Court of Justice in the form of being its own form of dispute resolution. And so to me, this moment is most reminiscent probably of 1937, where people were most skeptical about international law after the Spanish Civil War and after what they'd seen in Ethiopia. And then that was further fermented by what happened in World War II. And then you had the international community come together and formulate the UN Charter and formulate the Geneva Conventions. At that time, still, we only had 67 states actually participating in the negotiations for these incredibly important documents. In terms of, I just want to bring back the hope, perhaps to bring back the promise of international law. So what do you think, as an international lawyer, what hope do you have in the rise of China, in the skepticism that everybody, especially in the global South, is feeling right now in terms of, reinvigorating some form of international law, which works for the many and not just the few?
Look, Aisha, I think really at your guess is as good as mine. We're going through a period of immense flux, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't think Donald Trump knows what his next move is going to be, and the impact it's going to have. The Chinese, we've seen that they do prefer, at least in their dealings, some form of order as opposed to controlled chaos, if you will, right? And I do think that they are trying to create mechanisms which rival, or at least in part protect their interests vis-a-vis the United States and European countries as well, the West in general, if you will. So I do think that they are going to be creating mechanisms which allow for countries that are in their sphere of influence and in their not just regionally, but countries that are not really aligned with the West anymore. And that list, I think, is getting smaller day by day. Right, there are fewer states that are, entirely purely Western centric and support the West like that. There are more and more countries that are looking at, say, the East. They're looking at China, and they're looking at alternatives to. And I think the West itself is to blame for a lot of this. The way the U.S. has really bullied a lot of the world. And done a lot of arm twisting to get its way. And now we're just seeing that strategy on steroids, really, right? This naked aggression that we're seeing, whether it is through trade, trade and the tariffs that Trump is imposing, which doesn't take into account things like, for example, the service deficit that other countries have. Like the U.S. sells far more services to the world than goods it's importing, right? And Trump isn't taking that into account when he's doing his tariff calculations, which is a very rudimentary analysis that he's doing in any case. So I think people are sick and tired of that. This is something that really I think will die with with Trump when he's out of office. I don't think it's sustainable really in any long-term way. And what it's really doing is only hastening, the US withdrawal from the system and the Western influence that they can wield on how countries regulate their behavior, how they interact, and all of those issues. So is China coming up with an alternative? I think it's the only logical solution to this. Is it going to, say, replace and start funding, say, the UN and really supplant the US in that way? It remains to be seen. It certainly has the means to do so, whether it is financial means or the technical capability in many regards. It's developing that and has that, but it's going to take some time, right? The shift isn't going to be so swift because China there's that huge language barrier. There is a cultural barrier, I would say, right? People are used to working in a Western environment and operating. International diplomacy conducts itself according to those norms and standards. So I think it's going to take some time, but I think countries are making that shift already, especially on the economic front. We're seeing that.
So in terms of going back to what you were saying about how the last 2 years, especially for international lawyers, has really taken away the hope in the institution of international law, especially in the form of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, the Israeli assault in Lebanon, Syria, and most recently Iran. What do you think about how much in the UN Charter in particular is being undermined, the laws of war are being undermined, and yet the international community, we have not had one Security Council resolution because of the US veto going against what Israel is doing. What signals do you think that sends to the rest of the world in terms of the impunity with which Israel can act?
So I think, we're very clear on this. The signal that it sends is a very negative one, is that, international law has no sanctity and it certainly has no enforceability. We've had countries that for the longest time have been the greatest proponents of international law, denying that they will ever arrest Netanyahu for the ICC warrants that they are parties to, the Rome Statute that they're parties to, and the ICC and the warrants that it's issued. So international law as a procedural creation worked fine. The warrants were issued by the ICC prosecutor, by the courts. But their enforceability, the assumption that states would comply with this because of the moral and ethical force that it carried, right? The violation of the most important elements of international law that are protecting life, preventing war crimes, preventing things like genocide, right? We've found the international community, especially the West, that has for so long underwritten and been the biggest proponents of this, wanting completely in this regard. They've simply denied that we will not arrest Netanyahu. And so it really comes down to this, like, it's okay if a man with brown skin or black skin commits, we're going to, take whatever action is necessary. We're going to arrest them from their countries. We're going to topple regimes if we have to. That's fine. But if it's one of us, if the melatonin levels in our skin are lighter, we are going to do whatever it is in our power to prevent anything from happening to them, right? And we're going to allow it to happen continuously. So, and that's one aspect of it, right? The clear, blatant violations of international. But I think also what the last 2 years, and especially Israel's actions, have done is expose the fragility of international law, right? Now, in a domestic system, you have, the courts that can interpret, the legal legislation and the legal system in a particular way. In international law, it's really left up to the states to do that. And what we've seen Israel do with regards to, say, the Geneva Conventions, and actually you know this better than I do, but there's the principle of proportionality, that whenever you attack a target, you have to ensure that the military advantage significantly outweighs any collateral damage to civilians or any collateral losses to civilians and civilian property. What we see here is, now this leaves quite a bit of leeway. And the way this is interpreted by, say, the Israelis gives them immense latitude when it comes to the attacks that they do. So they've simply said that, the military advantage that we gain from killing a low-level Hamas commander outweighs the civilian deaths of 100 Palestinians, right? Now that is, interpreting international law to the extent that it's broken, right? It has no value anymore. And if that's what they're going to do, and we've seen this time and time and time again, every single day, where If it's not outright violations where they're shooting children with snipers in the head, they are interpreting and then justifying their actions and then calling themselves the most moral army in the world.
Yeah.
If every state started doing that, you would have, the end of the world, right? That's how the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a legal interpretation. And so, this is what the fear is.
I agree with that in part. I also think a little bit, especially when it comes to refugees, the issue from the reason I cut the global south some slack is because they're not the ones creating wars which create refugees. They're not the ones creating them and then leaving them for other neighboring countries in the global south to deal with. We have not caused any kind of immigrant crisis in the north, in the global north, that we should be taking responsibility for. So I think in those ways we are just abiding by international law, and especially when it comes to this selective rules-based international order, this term that has been thrown around a lot since 9/11, I think, and now it's kind of being discarded as this is like a way in which you can selectively condemn certain countries and not others. And we need to return then to international law. Let's just compare conduct to the law.
I think so. With regard to selective implementation of international law, I think that's the mantra for every single country. So there's not a single international institution, there's not a single country which has been immune from this implementation. So the whole sort of politics of international law is the countries follow international law until it's start affecting their agendas or their policies. So again, if you're asking me how we can change it or how, like, but that's the reality of international law that countries doing, but including global south. I don't want to say Pakistan again and again, but global south has been doing the same thing. We talk about environment, and we think that global north has, or developed countries have, sort of all sort of historical emissions are from global north, but what sort of environmental initiatives are we taking within the global south? Are we talking to each other? For example, India and Pakistan, are we talking to each other about, forget about India's water right now, but are we talking about smog? Are we talking about which paralyzed the Punjab of both countries for almost 3 to 4 months? And it has economic cost, it has human cost, but we are not willing to talk. And something is causing it domestically, regionally, something, it's not that something is coming from US. It's something which is a very, very regional thing. So what type of initiatives are we taking? So, Global South itself has to, and, to be honest, I'm not a huge, I've said Global South 1,000 times already, but I'm not a huge fan of this, because international, so, we have this criticism on international law that's very, very European. So what we wanted, we want it to be very, very, global south. International law has to be truly international, and then everybody has to be part of it. So, but regardless, regional countries have to come together to solve their problems and implement international law. And so, see, international law is just not what UN applies. So, for example, what EU does is also part of the international law. So, African Union works well with human rights, but then they also have problem with certain countries have problem within the region with regard to regional bodies implementing rules over there. South Asia is dead with regard to regional cooperation. So it's until unless with so the essential principle of international law is good faith. States have to come together to implement principles of international law in good faith. Otherwise, under international law is under scrutiny because of what is happening in Gaza. But my only, and again, with utmost respect for Palestinians and their struggle, this is not the first time, and we know that this is not the last time. We have seen this in Bosnia, we have seen this in Rwanda, and because it was not the age of social media, but the Bosnian genocide was recorded and covered by international media. the genocide happened and approximately 8,000 people were killed. But overall, in that conflict, more than 100,000 people died. And we have been through this many times in the history, and international law has always come stronger. It has failed and it has come stronger. So today we see that international community is failing. We have to understand in Bosnia there was a UN force who was supposed to protect people, but it failed. That genocide happened almost under the auspices of peacekeeping forces. Maybe it's not the right word, but they were there and they failed to protect. So what happened in Palestine is really a huge failure for everybody, but it might be unique in terms that it's been televised live, but it's not something that never happened before. Similar things have happened to various communities across the world. So but the only thing is that countries have to come together, make sure that this never happens again, especially the culture of impunity has to end, and some sort of accountability. So even if you believe that Israel as a non-party is not supposed to follow the sort of instructions or procedures or proceedings at ICC. But there has to be some accountability for both countries. If anybody has done any sort of war crime from both sides, they have to. And I'm not doing trying to balance the both sides, but when it's the principle of international humanitarian law, you cannot kill civilian regardless of how justified your cause is. So that culture of impunity has to end, and the world, only when the world will come together, they will find solution to this problem. They will have to punish those who were culprits, and finally make a structure which is better than this, which sort of break that cycle of violence, not only in the Middle East but everywhere else also.
When I speak about the sanctity of international law, I'm not just talking about people, paying lip service to it, but also interpreting it in letter and spirit to keep it functional. And that is really dependent on the states, on their domestic legal systems. And that is not the direction I see the world going in. We've seen, I don't want to say populist governments, but we're seeing governments that are more, ever more nationalistic and looking inwards rather than trying to ensure that there's peace and harmony around the world. So yeah, that's it.
And I think when it comes to looking at the principle of proportionality, even when you study that principle, there's no algorithm, there's no number value given to the amount of civilians that can be killed in collateral damage to the military asset that you're targeting. It is so entirely subjective. And so when you see Israeli spokespeople and IDF spokespeople come out and say, no, but that Hamas commander was incredibly important and that's why we had to go in. And also they're using them as human shields, which means that really they're not civilians that we should take into account in the proportionality calculation. You realize that the laws of war in themselves are so incredibly indeterminate that they're not really fit for purpose to the kind of conflicts that we're seeing, especially when you can bomb a Jabalia refugee camp and 200 can die, and you can be like, oh no, but the Hamas commanders there were incredibly important. If they were that important, if every Hamas commander that you took out in all of these attacks was that important, you would still not be waging the war 2 years later.
Absolutely. And just as a final point, you're 100% right that international, especially in the public imagination, has been a spectacular failure over the last 2 years, right? But at the same time, I think there is some value still to international, and that is really looking at it as the lexicon or the language of critique, right? Where international law, fine, it can't be enforced in that sense, but it provides you with that yardstick by which you can judge action
Completely.
by states, right? It gives you a measure by which right and wrong. So the term genocide, for example, or the term war crimes, the only reason we can use this as a form of critique against Israeli actions or Russian actions or Ukrainian actions or American actions for that matter, is because there's an international consensus. Countries have come together and said, we accept this term as genocide, the intentional killing and destruction of the people. as something that is morally wrong, first of all, but also this is something we all agree on. Otherwise, just as Israel has warped interpretations of international law, it would have been warping interpretations here as well. But there is now common consensus being developed, or has really, coalesced around these definitions. And that is what gives us this very powerful tool. So the Palestinians, when they can get up and they can, go to other countries and within their own courts, where you have the principles of universal jurisdiction. So countries like Argentina, countries like, several European countries as well. You can have cases brought against, violators of acts being done in Palestine, even though those countries are far away and they don't really have jurisdiction like that. But you can, because there is this international understanding that there are certain actions that are not permitted, that these are to be condemned, and that action is supposed to be taken and enforced in some mechanism. So I think that really is important. Understanding that language, that international law still serves a very fundamental purpose, and that is that it is the language of critique, even in this day and age.
I completely agree with you, and I completely agree because if you didn't have international law, it would be like, what is wrong then about what Israel is doing? We have to, again, exactly as you said, that language of critique. And I think it is just a sad reality of international law that it often applies ex post facto. So maybe the International Court of Justice in 7 years will be like, what happened in the Gaza Strip in these 2 years was a genocide. And I'm now very hopeful that that is what the court will come back and decide, because to me, it can't be anything but at this stage.
Well, I'm glad, Ayesha, that you
It took me a while to get there. At the beginning, I did not think 6 months. For the first 6 months, I did not think it was a genocide. From May.
The war and tactics have evolved as well, right? So I don't blame you on that as well.
Yeah, and I also think that if you didn't have these rules, you would have rules which were so similar, because the laws of war have such ancient roots in the Bible, in the Quran. We had these laws then. So the laws that stand, they would be incredibly similar. The enforcement, I do hope that this is a galvanizing moment for the international community. I think it will take us a lot longer to get there. I think that the way America is going, the kind of internal critique now we have with the Epstein files, especially, they are on that trajectory now where the Americans themselves are critiquing it, and perhaps with the rise of China, because I think that China, as in that multipolar world, the reason that Israel is not being critiqued so heavily by the American military in particular is because they're worried that they're going to have to use exactly the same yardsticks that the Israelis used against China. And I think that would be even more interesting when you have not so much asymmetry in military relations, but complete parity. What happens then?
Absolutely. And you're 100% right, because the last part has been against, there've been asymmetrical wars. There's been this overwhelming force against a ragtag group of rebels, and it's lost even those wars, right?
It's lost even then. Yeah.
So if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at other places, Yemen is another example where traditional forms of military might really don't translate well in the field and on the ground. You had the Saudis trying to destroy Yemen for the longest time, and they've been able to fire missiles into Israel. You've had the Americans spectacularly fail in Afghanistan and really delay by 20 years what was inevitable, and what the Pakistanis kept on telling them was inevitable, the return of the flood.
But I'm glad for us to end on that note of hope as international lawyers, that fine, we can only offer you pieces of paper, but they're important pieces of paper. They're important to the victims, they're important to the perpetrators. The fact that IDF soldiers years from now will not be able to travel to another country for fear of an arrest warrant in a local domestic court, I think that is still incredibly important.
Absolutely. No, it certainly gives us hope.
And when we think about Cold War, UN was actually dead. But a lot of important laws that we have today, including the Vienna Convention of Law treaties, was made during that time. Law of sea, we have major development with regard to law of sea. We have major development with regard to space laws. And even today, when multilateralism is dead, it's under immense pressure. There is an international polarization. It's difficult to get treaties. We still manage to have soft laws on cyber, on AI, on trade. And on health regulations, in last few years, and we have arms treaty in last 20 years, so all these things are still possible. So imagine with all this rift and this polarization we are still making. So international law is not failing. International law, the growth of international law in space has probably reduced, but it's also because of the saturation point, because there are so many laws already for so many things. But every single day, there is some sort of norm making, there is some sort of implementation, and even the countries like who were major violators of international law, like Israel, or so for example, they are violating IHL, they are violating ICJ's judgment, they are violating UN Charter, but so many other things they are doing. For example, international aviation law, space law, they follow those regulations every single day. So I think there are so many naysayers with regard to international law, and people believe that international law is failing. And so I just want to say, if you think that a weak international law is a problem, imagine a world without international law.
Yeah.
Where there will be no principle. At least we have their standards against which we measure the legal and illegal acts. Once we don't have that structure, then we don't have those standards. Imagine, so say for example, apartheid. That is international law. Otherwise, apartheid is not possible without state sanctioned policies. So domestic law justifies apartheid policy, and that's why essentially what apartheid is. But it's international law that not only outlaws it, but in certain cases punishes it. So I think when the problem in international law is not less of it's more of it, and in better international law and better implementation. So that's one thing that I think that I haven't said, but
that's great, and a good point to end it on, a point of hope. More international law, not less. As you've heard in this episode, there is much to be hopeless and to be hopeful about. And I would just like to end by quoting Eyal Ben-Venisti, an international lawyer, who said that even if powerless to restrain those strong enough to disregard it, international law at least persists in declaring and condemning raw assertions of power as illegal. Thus, the project of international law has not been in vain. That's all for this episode of Legally Speaking. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week with more. This is Ayesha Malik from DawnNews English.
Powered by International Committee of the Red Cross.